Hello, everyone, and welcome back to English 1110. I hope that you are doing well and that you have been enjoying your summer as much as possible in the midst of any, summer classes besides mine, or perhaps just mine, that you are doing at the same time. We're going to go ahead and dive into your in-depth lecture for week 5 and go through all of the good stuff we have this week in regards to comics, zines, independent publishing, and why this kind of genre and just art form is a really important kind of pit stop, if you will, in terms of how we are thinking about Americanness and just how we're thinking about kind of the communication of messages in popular culture more broadly. So as I mentioned, this is your week 5 in-depth lecture, and I've titled it Geometrizing and Storyfying a Narrative, the Storytelling System and Co-Creation in Comics and Zines. Now, some of these terms may not be familiar at this point, and that's totally fine because I'm going to be walking you through these terms and how these concepts are going to be applied to your readings that you have for this week. So this is really an introduction then to comic book storytelling and zine narratives. And, for me, it's important that we attend to how comics and zines are used to convey messages, not only to get us away from music videos for a week, but also because when we think about the accessibility of creating art, comics and zines are perhaps some of the more accessible forms that folks can take and use as a way of conveying and communicating messages, right? A lot of what we've looked at so far are, mediums that are going to require not only access to Hollywood or access to, a larger amount of capital, but they're also at times going to be texts that, go through many different just kind of layers of review, I suppose, before we engage with them. And that's not to say that comics and zines don't also go through a number of review steps and processes, but those, steps and processes definitely look a little bit different than what we would get with a music video, okay? So what's on the agenda for this week is we are going to be doing pop culture concepts for close reading comics, recommended media links to watch, and this week's comic style zines, all of which are hyperlinked in this agenda, meaning that you can move between them by clicking on any of the yellow highlighted bullet points that you see here, okay? So let's go ahead and start with pop culture concepts for close reading comics. As always, I strongly encourage you to take notes here. It's going to be more helpful for you to take notes before, starting the assignment for this week, but also by having notes, you've already kind of started to process some of this information. And so by the time you sit down to do the process post, it's going to go by a lot faster if you've done that labor, okay? So let's start out by defining zines. Now, I include an excerpt here from Alison Piepmeyer's Girl Zines, Making Media, Doing Feminism. And the reason I do this is because she provides us with a pretty solid definition to kind of work with in terms of kind of what exactly is a zine. Now, zine, of course, we can think of as a shortened version of the word magazine. And a zine is going to be, according to Piepmeyer, quirky, individualized booklets filled with diatribes, reworkings of pop culture iconography, and all variety of personal and political narratives. They are self-produced and anti-corporate. Their production, philosophy, and aesthetic are anti-professional. Most zines are messy, photocopied documents that may contain handwriting, collage art, and even stickers and glitter. Because zines are ephemeral underground publications, it's impossible to determine how many are in circulation. Now, if we were in person for this class, I would have a bunch of comics and zines laid out on a table in front of you so you could actually kind of engage with the materiality of these. But what's important to kind of take from this is that Piepmeyer is really impressing the fact that these are handmade creations, right? Folks are using what they have access to, what's going to be readily available for them to create and convey the message that they want to kind of put out there. But also zines very much are, kind of publications that are reliant on folks, photocopying and Xeroxing and printing and distributing in kind of self-created ways, as opposed to having kind of a formal distribution structure. Now, lately, with the advent of social media and of course the internet changing kind of how publishing industries look in the 2000s, we do see a shift that some comics and zines creators now distribute their zines through Etsy shops, through websites, through, a number of different kind of virtual platforms. And of course, one of the most common ways to distribute zines and other independently created materials would be comics conventions and zines, kind of zine shows, though those have been kind of on a standstill a little bit with the pandemic that we've been kind of, existing through, generally zines are going to be understood as those kinds of handmade, do-it-yourself DIY creations that someone, or a group of someone, sorry, I keep scratching, my back is itchy, a group of someone's or a single individual are creating to make a point about something. Okay. And again, there's really no rules when it comes to zine and comic creation. Especially with zines, I mean, you see folks using all sorts of materials, and especially when you look at a zine publication, kind of one of the benefits of using different kinds of things like stickers or stencils, or cutting out paper and then taping it onto another piece of paper and then scanning it, is that when it's scanned, you get a lot of really nice kind of texture and dimension that kind of pops off the page in that way. Okay. Now, I included another excerpt from Piepmeier where she kind of talks about and grounds zines within US capitalism. And she writes, they are an example of participatory media created by consumers rather than by the corporate culture industries. And as such, despite predictions of their demise predictions of their demise in the mid-1990s due to the rise of the internet, they are part of a continuing trend in late capitalist culture. Zines created by girls and women are sites where girls and women construct identities, communities, and explanatory narratives from the materials that comprise their cultural moment, discourses, media representations, ideologies, stereotypes, and even physical detritus. So what she's really getting at here, and of course she talks about girls and women because that's kind of her primary creator base that she's concentrating on in this particular work. That doesn't mean that, like non-binary folks or like men or whoever are not also making zines, but she's focusing specifically here on girl and women creators, but especially girl creators. But what Piepmeier is getting at, is that she's kind of concentrating on the fact that the zine form allows the individual to participate in media in ways that are a little bit different from other forms, right? A lot of times when we talk about, and you'll hear me talk about this as well, when we talk about kind of US popular culture, we can understand that individual people who view pop culture, who engage with pop culture, are generally talked about as consumers, right? They're like our relationship to what we purchase, what we watch. We're kind of situated as being exclusively operating in kind of a consumption form, meaning that like we are consuming what other people, specifically other corporations and entities, are making. But what Piepmeier is getting at here is that with zines and independent publishing, the individual who might be a fan in some spaces or a consumer in other spaces, whether it's on like, message boards or blogs or fan magazines or whatever else it might be, in the space of the zine, they have the opportunity to kind of take control of the narrative and exercise their agency as an individual who has a voice, right? Because you're not having to go through all of these layers to kind of have your voice heard. You're able to say something and distribute it immediately. And that creative kind of labor of making something, making copies of it, and then distributing it is something that the individual can do without these larger entities in control. And as she's pointing to, we want to be cautious not to overlook independent publishing just because it's independently published. And we instead want to recognize the fact that these publications are spaces where folks are having conversations about anything from the residential school system that affects Indigenous folks in the Americas, having conversations about mental health, conversations about burnout from working in domestic abuse shelters, right? Like there's so many different topics that someone can have a conversation about in a zine and then sell and distribute it. And also can really be a space where also anthologies take place, and just in general can really be an exploratory site where someone can also raise questions such as, why in mainstream media am I seeing a very specific set of stereotypes or representations for certain marginalized groups, okay? Now I include Piepmeier's bio here so that you have some background information on her, because it's, as we'll talk about kind of in a few weeks, when we talk about the annotated bibliography, it's really important to kind of have a sense of who an author is that you're citing. I'm not going to go into it in too much detail here, but I will note that she, was a professor who was specializing in, kind of women's studies, girlhood studies was a big focus, disability studies, but especially she was very much concentrated on kind of zines and zine creators. She unfortunately has passed away, which is why her bio is written in the past tense, but super awesome scholar who like really gave kind of a lot of thought and attention to, you know, recognizing that we don't always legitimize or even pay attention to the work done by girls because our culture is so quick to dismiss girls' interests, girls, you know, voices, so on and so forth. Here are some examples of kind of, you know, zines that, you know, or kind of, I guess I should say like kind of documentation of zines that can be kind of helpful reference points. One of which is this color and activity book by the feminist band Bikini Kill, which was kind of a riot girl band that very much like at their shows, they were women in the punk scene in the 90s. And so a lot of what they were doing was kind of making zines about issues facing kind of women and femme folks, such as abortion and sexual assault, and just kind of various different layers of kind of harm and violence and violation that women and femme folks often face. And then they would distribute these materials at their shows. A big part also of kind of the riot girl movement we see, which is kind of documented in this collection, which I encourage you to check out if you are interested in this, because they bring together all of these different kind of publications. Something that was kind of really important about these, right, is the fact that like, as Pietmeyer speaks about in the excerpt that I pulled for you, these are ephemeral media, meaning that they're not necessarily going through formal publishers. And so archiving and collecting and saving these materials can sometimes be a bit tricky, and sometimes they can kind of get lost over time, right? But if we really stop to think about kind of the power and agency behind determining that you have something that you want to say, making something that addresses the things you want to say, copying and distributing that, that's a lot of power that is then harnessed by the individual without having to be shielded by an institution. And this graphic down here I really love because it kind of helps to visualize in some ways this process of like, when we think about kind of specifically zines made by girls and by women, we can really understand kind of the girl's bedroom as a central site for this, right? That in the bedroom where, you know, you might go to listen to music, to read magazines, to kind of be in that consumer role. We can also recognize the girl's bedroom as being a place where in listening to music, girls are doing creative labor, such as, you know, making playlists and sharing those, or like cutting up magazines that they're buying and repurposing them into collages or into zines, so on and so forth, right? And so all of this is to say that although the materials that we're reading this week are not exclusively by and about girls and women, I wanted to just kind of mention that girls and women have a really strong presence and just kind of contributing voice to this movement of zine creation. And so what I want us to transition to then is thinking about concepts that are going to kind of help us to talk about some of these just like issues related to zine publishing and comics publishing, but also just kind of how we can start to unpack the ways that we can close read these materials. Obviously, up until now, we've been concentrating on music videos, and that's vastly different from how we would kind of arrive at a zine, although we can use some of the same tools in our toolkit. So, you know, ordinarily I would have you read Frederick Luis Aldama's Latinx Superheroes in Mainstream Comics. Typically, I'd pull an excerpt for you. And what we would do is kind of work through that excerpt as a companion piece to the zines that you have for today. Instead, I've kind of condensed that down by giving you a nice overview of those concepts instead of making you read them. So it's going to be important that you really pay attention to this part of the lecture because it's going to really guide you through the language you're going to want to use in your process post. So the concepts from Aldama that we're going to be attending to are covers and paratext, co-creation, visual and verbal elements of a comic, and geometrizing and storyfying. Those are going to be what really kind of carries us through. And I apologize that I'm fidgeting with my lighting. The light changes so weird. It's one of those like rainy days. And so one second it's like really dark, the next second it's really bright, and I keep having to change my lights. The life of teaching through the computer. And so I've included Aldama's bio here. He's actually transitioned to a new position at UT Austin. So he's no longer at Ohio State. Otherwise, I would say, you know, if you're interested in film and comics, he would be a great professor to kind of look at taking classes from. But really his bread and butter is film, comics, kind of graphic narratives about, people of color, but specifically about Black, Indigenous, and Latinx characters. So in thinking about kind of how we're going to wander through, I suppose, these concepts, what I want us to really think about is kind of the role of a cover. And this is something that Aldama really emphasizes in his book and throughout kind of, all the chapters, but especially the excerpt I would generally have you read. And so when we think about, the process of physically going into a Barnes and Noble or the bookstore at school, or, buying things online, right? The cover is really going to be kind of something that we might think is easy to overlook when in fact it actually is a huge source of decision making. And so Aldama attributes the power of the cover to being the reader's first point of contact. And he says that covers are our first encounter with a comic book and possibly a series. As a first contract, they can entice us or not to open and scan, then own or borrow the comic for a good read and reread. The visuals shape a summary of the total contents of the story. In addition to providing a summary of the content, their respective covers actually add to the comic book itself. They supply something additional to a summary. Their cover art intensifies the experience of the comic as an aesthetic whole. So what he's getting at here is that the cover is going to not only summarize and synthesize everything that we're going to see on the inside, but it's also going to be sort of the kind of deciding factor in a lot of cases as to whether or not we're actually going to pause and engage with this material at all, right? An engaging cover is going to be the deciding factor as to whether or not we actually open the book, open the comic book, and decide if we want to continue reading, if we want to continue engaging with the whole series, right? But also the work of that cover is to ensure that what we see on the cover is going to kind of not only preview what's in the comic, but in some ways match what's in the comic, right? Because you don't necessarily want to have a cover that's really exciting and interesting to look at, and then it doesn't actually match what's happening inside of the book, right? And so there's a lot of kind of work that has to happen with that cover to ensure not only that the reader is interested and that the reader is engaged, but that the book is really doing justice to what is happening in the plot and inside. Now, the cover can be understood as part of the paratext or paratextual materials of the comic book. And the paratext is the material that comes before or after the main story. It is typically what the reader will encounter first before the story itself. These materials help to shape our impressions of what the story will be about. And I want to just flag here that paratext is not exclusive to comic books. We're going to see paratext, in film, in literature, across different genres. It's not just going to be exclusively comic books. Paratext includes the front and back cover, the dedication, the preface, introduction, and epilogue, and the credit page. And again, the cover gives a snapshot of the contents, as Aldama says, and giving shape to the paratextual materials like the title and credit page that follow the cover is hugely important too for introducing overarching themes and moods. And so again, if the paratext is everything that's surrounding the actual start and end of the story, we want to consider then that while paratext is sometimes skimmed or skipped entirely by the reader, it actually is an important kind of marker for us of who's involved in this project, how is this project being framed or presented to us, right? Paratext oftentimes is kind of especially important when you have a reissued version of a book or a collection, for example, in which the kind of editor or author is going ahead and, offering a new introduction or kind of an updated preface, whatever it might be, right? There's really good stuff that we want to be attentive to in the paratext. And so here, for example, in the kind of paratext for Blackbird, we have kind of the creators' names, we have all of the folks who are involved, we have the publisher, we have information on when this first issue was released, right? We have all of this information kind of provided to us. It is going to be a necessary stepping stone for us to be able to also kind of move potentially through different creators' works, right? Like let's say that you really enjoy the illustration style of Jen Bartel. Knowing that she's working on Blackbird, right, is going to allow you to not only know her name, but also be able to potentially engage with other projects of hers. And so we don't want to discount the power then of that paratext. I've included a couple other examples of paratext here, and kind of thinking about what are some of the kinds of information we might see with something here like Abbott. From Boom, we have kind of, once again, a very standard kind of overview of who's involved with this project in terms of the kind of illustrators and the authors. I want to note with comics as well, as I'll show kind of later in this lecture, you don't have a single person working on the illustrations. You of course have multiple people and they're all kind of fulfilling different roles. Some texts or comics like La Boriqueña might have kind of material that is also included, such as vinyl figures and just kind of figurines and other kinds of kind of just material objects that one could buy if they're a fan of a particular character. But also generally some stories like this excerpt from kind of an indie comic that I picked up a few years ago might provide us with a character list if the plot is going to be really complex or kind of require from us a familiarity of sorts with a series of characters who are going to kind of show up across the narrative and over time. Now, something that's really important about our engagement with comics and about zines is co-creation. And Aldama tells us that because of our capacity for active co-creation, we are not bound to the comic in determinative ways. We aren't sponges that passively absorb superheroes that don't look or act like us. Maybe the superhero is older, white, straight, and male. This doesn't mean that those of us who don't identify within these categories can't co-create such a figure as our own. As our attention moves back and forth between the reading elements, verbal, and the drawn elements, visual, we perceive, interpret, and feel in a loosely guided way. And in doing so, we fill in the gaps with our own experiences and identities. We make it our own. So what he's getting at here is that when you're reading a comic, the comic is not simply just happening to you, where you have no agency within the storytelling and you just have to kind of passively accept it for what it is. Instead, what he's proposing is that co-creation is the act through which a reader is actively making choices and changes to the story as they are reading it. Now, what he's kind of pointing to as evidence of this then is that as we're engaging with the reading elements or the verbal elements and the drawn elements of the visual, which we'll kind of unpack a little bit more in a moment, we are finding ways to connect with characters. We're finding ways to perhaps ship characters together that aren't, you know, situated as being in a relationship or together in the actual narrative, right? We're making tweaks and changes that make the reading experience enjoyable or exciting or inviting. Because as he's pointing to here, while we have a clear trend of, you know, superheroes, especially in US comics, being typically presented to us as white, male, you know, cis, heterosexual, excuse me, so on and so forth. Not everybody is able to relate to those characters, right? It's very limited. I'm back. I don't know what that coughing fit was all of a sudden. Anyways, yes, not everyone can identify with the straight white male protagonist that we see so, you know, foregrounded in US superhero comics. And therefore, what Aldama is getting at is that when we revise, modify, you know, creatively engage with something we're reading, we're co-creating the story. We're not just letting it happen to us. All right, so according to Aldama, there are two main subsystems of comic book storytelling. One is visual and one is verbal. So let's unpack this a little bit, because the relationship between content and form that we've been talking about with music videos is very much going to help us here as we do this analytical work. So geometric shaping and geometrizing are terms that he uses throughout Latinx superheroes in mainstream comics to really help us understand these visual details of a narrative. Okay, and so he defines it as the skillful and willful visualizing or geometrizing of character, theme, and plot that guides our gap-filling processes and shapes our experience of a given comic book. It's the visuals that primarily drive our co-creative insertion into a story world. The shape, color, and posture guide how we make sense of the character, how we understand the character to be in the world, and the geometrizing of other elements in the story world, such as the written text, can allow us to experience their physicality. So what he's getting at here is that the visual details that we see, but specifically kind of the visual shaping of the story world, is going to be a really important means through which we engage with a comic book, okay? It's going to be how the character is drawn, right? How are we experiencing the world around them? You know, how are we understanding our kind of place in the world as a reader based on all of these different visual details? How are we understanding what it means to be someone existing in this place? Now, in thinking about making sense of the story world, he shares that, the skillful use of geometric shapes, circles, triangles, and rectangles, along with perspective, or adding a sense of weight and volume, for instance, can turn 2D lines on a page into a 3D experience in our minds. The geometrizing of the story doesn't end with shapes given to figures. There are the shapes given to the panels and their layout that guide the pacing of the story proper in our reading and our meaning-making processes. Visuals created in the specific sequencing of panels tells us as much about the story world and its characters. So I'm going to use this slide as well as the one prior to this really quickly. So if you look to the right here, you'll see that this excerpt from a comic that I pulled has 4 comic panels, which are going to be these right here. Now, each of these are drawn in a rectangular shape, right? Meaning that when you open up this comic, these 4 panels are going to take up the entirety of the page. You might notice that we don't have any words happening in these panels. We're exclusively working with the kind of geometrizing or the shaping of the story world and how this particular creator, Miguel C. Hernandez, is choosing to present to us the cityscape that we're getting here, right? And kind of our protagonist and how exactly we are seeing the movement happening throughout this world. Now, you'll notice that kind of comics in some ways rely on the reader being able to move from one panel to the next, and in this kind of gutter space right here, which is this white line, that meaning making is happening, that you're able to make the logical leap from one place to the next in order to follow along with the story, right? And so as Aldana's pointing to, the creators are using circles, triangles, and rectangles to kind of, develop a kind of story world that visually is going to connect with the characters, with us as readers, and are going to add some depth and shape to the panel, right? So for example, the cityscape doesn't look totally flat, even though it's being brought to us on a flat piece of paper, right? You have to have some depth, some dimension that's going to make the buildings have shadows, that's going to make them stand out to us on this night street. In looking back at this slide, where we have this kind of panel from a Peanuts comic, you'll notice that we have the word pound in the background as we have these 2 characters kind of in a physical altercation in front of that word. Now, not only is geometric shaping happening here in terms of the shape of the character, in terms of like hair and body shape and costuming and facial expressions, right? All of the same kinds of things we've been thinking about in terms of content and form and flash findings. But we also notice that this pound is adding to the lines that we're getting here, right? We have kind of these squiggle lines and kind of the florally kind of star type situation happening here along with these lines here, all of which are helping to show the motion that is happening, right? Of kind of the movement of bopping someone on the head. And especially that is going to really happen with this white kind of section right here. So we have color, we have lines, right? We have kind of the impact of the lines and placement of the lines all participating in this. And then this word pound, we're also getting in kind of capital letters, right? In red coloring, we have a really large amount of the panel filled up by this word, right? All of which is complementing and extending the impact of that visual moment. Now, of course, pound is a written word and it is a verbal element in the sense that it is something that is written out that we can read, but we can also read the visuals as Aldana is telling us. And so in this case, pound is functioning as both a visual and a verbal element, of not only a verbal element that's giving us storyline, but a visual element that's really showing and indicating and emphasizing impact here. Now, in this panel from Blackbird, we have a yow happening here, right? An exclamation. But, unlike pound, which is in the background of this panel, we have the yow kind of in the foreground as this character is moving. And we can tell that she's in motion in part because we have kind of the, placement of her body moving in a particular direction, right? She's positioned in such a way that we can kind of see the impact of her flying. We also have the color and lighting back here that are helping to indicate this. But then the yow that we're getting here is an exclamation that we understand to be something that she's saying, because we have kind of this like pointed, what's it called? Kind of pointed line that's kind of, going to be placed near her mouth to indicate this is something that she's saying, as opposed to a thought bubble that's going to, kind of indicate that she's thinking something. And if we think about, once again, this verbal element that's kind of complementing and extending the visual, yow, of course, once again, is a visual and verbal element, but it's also kind of helping to intensify the mood and the feeling that we're getting in this panel. Because although we would be able to recognize that Nina, the protagonist of Blackbird, is of course experiencing something kind of overwhelming in this panel, it's really with that yow and that kind of verbal element that we're understanding how exactly she is feeling, right? So it's adding on and extending the impact. Now, when we think about panels, to kind of backtrack a little bit to the example I showed you momentarily ago of Miguel C. Hernandez, we can recognize that, panels are something that are going to, of course, move the page in such a way that the reader, is being directed in reading in a particular way, but it's also going to help complement the mood and the plot of our story. So for example, over here on this page, we have kind of a zigzag kind of form in this section of the page with our panels. And then we have kind of more evenly balanced panels down here. We of course have kind of rectangle shapes at the bottom, and we have kind of these almost like awkward triangle-esque shapes towards the top. But as you notice here, we have these speech bubbles that are giving us insight into what these characters are saying. And we have these yellow narrator boxes that are kind of telling us what's happening without it being said by the characters. Now, in this moment of conflict, we can see that the panels really reflect that conflict and that tension by kind of zigzagging to kind of visualize the just kind of like rupture to normalcy that's happening. In this page from Abbott, we can see that we have a lot going on. It's a very chaotic kind of first page. And it's going to be a page that really, is opening up the comic, but is one that is, kind of giving us a lot of backstory. It's giving us time, it's giving us place, it's giving us quite a bit to move into. And so as far as kind of getting us grounded in the story world, this is one that's kind of blending together or collaging together, if you will, so many different elements to ensure that we really have a sense of the story world that we're entering into. And then on this kind of third one over here, of America Chavez by Gabby Rivera from Marvel, we can see that kind of in this fight sequence that we have really thin, long panels that are being used to kind of visualize the intensity of this fight. Especially, I love this kind of POW panel right here, where we have kind of the BAM, once again, a visual and verbal element, but we have kind of the star-like cut is really impactful for kind of giving us some harmony here. Okay, in terms of kind of how all of these different shapes are working together. Whereas with this Abbott page, we of course have really small slices of a number of different things, and the color composition is going to really help to indicate all of the different places and things that we are really looking to, okay? Now, keywords from this excerpt from Aldama on the left-hand side include pencilers, inkers, colorists, geometrize, and master the techniques of their predecessors. And Batman Don't Shoot is the comic by Miguel C. Hernandez that we were just looking at the cityscape panels from. Now, what Aldama is really getting at in this excerpt that we won't go into too much detail about is the fact that we want to kind of give attention to, comics creators are really having to master the craft to be able to play with the rules, to bend the rules, but also to be able to really make their work as impactful as possible. And so, somebody who's penciling this comic, right, or who's inking or coloring this comic are going to really be the people who are kind of in charge of, outlining the lines that we get. How hard are those lines? How soft are those lines? What kinds of, colors are being used to bring the story to life? What kinds of, kind of colors between pages are being used? How are they perhaps recognizing techniques that work well and then applying them and maybe manipulating them or changing them to fit the message that they're trying to convey? Which brings us to the verbal elements of comic book storytelling, which is storyfy and storyfying. And storyfying is going to really come down to, how the verbal elements allow the creator or creators to provide insight into any given character. They allow the creator to invest a character with nuanced thoughts and feelings. The verbal elements provide the reader with a compass direction for more nuanced evaluation of character than might be present if only the visual shaping devices were used. So storyfying elements are going to include narrator boxes, dialogue, and thoughts of characters. Other aspects of the verbal subsystem are the names of characters and for superheroes, the names of their alter egos, how many languages are used in the comic, for example, are they bilingual or multilingual comics, and the narrator. And so this comic excerpt on the side here from Katie Skelly is one in which we can see that storyfying elements are quite important, that we have, ongoing dialogue between characters that are represented through these speech bubbles. And once again, storyfying elements are about, what is your character named? What languages do they speak? Do they have an alter ego, right? How is the narrator perhaps moving the narrative along? If we think back to how we've been talking about the protagonist versus the narrator in music videos, that sometimes the person who's singing isn't the main character in the music video treatment, right? All of these different dimensions are going to really emphasize for us, how are we getting to know characters and how are these characters existing in the world? And of course, with comics, since it's a visual medium, we have to recognize that the verbal elements or storyfying elements are, of course, something that we look at and that we see. But in terms of their contributions to the comic narrative, we're getting something a little bit different, right? The way that the character is drawn is going to be a geometrizing element, but what that character is saying is going to be a storyfying element. Okay. Now, a lot of these kinds of creative choices that a comics creator is going to make is going to largely depend on how much narrative space they have to play with. If somebody is working in a single panel comic mode, such as this, where we have a peanut comic, you don't have quite a bit of space to really give us an elaborate narrative. Instead, the creator is really going to have to ensure that whatever story that they're trying to tell or joke that they're trying to make, right, is going to be one that someone can readily pick up on in just having that single panel, because they're not going to have more rectangles or squares or circles or whatever the shape might be for that panel to be able to kind of get the rest of the story. Now, with 3-panel and 4-panel comics, like we see here with Calvin and Hobbes, for example, we can really see that, somebody is going to have a lot more narrative space to play with in order to tell the story. Largely in 3 and 4-panel comics, we have a lot of use of speech bubbles, of thought bubbles. We can kind of see a speech bubble used here and a thought bubble used here. And again, speech bubble indicating that someone is saying it out loud, thought bubble indicating that they are thinking it and not saying it. And then we can also kind of get, narrator boxes that tell us what's happening without the character having to say them. But with the sequencing of 3 and 4-panel comics, we still have to kind of recognize that that creator is having to make certain choices about movement, certain choices about how many characters to introduce, choices about what is the central conflict, right? How are each of these characters moving through the story, and what is relevant or necessary to know from the beginning or by the end? Is there a resolution? Is it open-ended? So on and so forth. Another technique that we see in comic book storytelling is the splash page. And a splash page is going to be a single page in a comic book where the creator has elected to fill up the entire page with one image rather than cutting it into those panels that we were just looking at. Now, oftentimes with a splash page, there's going to be a very consistent use of narrator boxes. A splash page is a great way to emphasize this is sort of a key touchstone moment in this narrative that I really want you to pay attention to, that's going to be really central to the plot, or perhaps is going to indicate kind of a big transition for the character and their own kind of personal growth, or perhaps represents a moment that someone's meeting another character who's going to be important to pay attention to. And so we have examples here from Lady Killer, from Blackbird, and from Nancy Drew. In each of these cases, we can recognize that, in some cases it's conversation, and kind of a changing of hands of things. In other cases, it's kind of a transition back onto the journey. And in other cases, it could just be a splash page that's used to kind of visualize the drama of somebody plummeting down through a very scary locale. Now, one of the comics that you're looking at for this week, and I apologize again for me fiddling with my light, but it's a rainy day and it's hard to keep the lighting consistent. One of the comics you'll be looking at this week is Couldn't Afford Therapy, So I Made This by Lawrence Lindell. And this is an excerpt from that comic, a 2-page spread from that comic that is, very much full of thought bubbles, speech bubbles, panels, right? We have kind of narrator boxes as well. If you look here, we have 3 panels that are kind of floating. They look quite different than what we have seen in previous examples, right? We also can see that there's a lot of storyfying elements that Lawrence Lindell relies on in their work, of just kind of, really condensing down space and then filling it with a lot of text. And when you look at the plot, it will be important to think about, why are they making those kinds of choices? We also see a lot of overlaying or overlapping where multiple boxes and shapes are being placed on top of each other. And so thinking about how those kinds of, visual choices are visualizing elements of the content will be really important engaging with this work. We also can see, kind of the use of things like checkboxes and just kind of like hard edges to things such as we see here, or just kind of more rounded edges can also determine sort of how something visually impacts or is intensified by the form. We also have this excerpt from Nest Comics by J.B. Kalagayan, in which he is kind of, taking his main character Lilliput through a sewer system where she's having to fight, monsters and all sorts of things. And we can also see kind of his reliance on panels once again, but we're not really getting narrator boxes or speech bubbles here that are telling us kind of what Lilliput is thinking. We can kind of pick up on that based on the uses of shading and color and kind of the composition of each of these panels, as well as the facial expressions and actions and physical bodily behaviors and reactions that we've also been looking at with music videos. Now in this section, I've got some recommended media links to watch. These are all relatively pretty short. I do really encourage you to engage with them because they are helpful for getting a visual sense of some of what I'm talking about. For example, this video from the Wall Street Journal in 2012 is a behind the scenes take with a superhero comic artist, and really is helpful to look at to get a sense of the process of developing and drawing covers. I strongly encourage you to watch this video because it really helps to kind of emphasize how exactly this creative process kind of takes form and what are all of the kinds of creative choices that go into some of those details like shading and inking and making these kinds of creative calls. I also have for you a creator interview with Corey Rockbottom Davis, who is the creator of Jet Boy, which is a comic that's presently being turned into an animation that hopefully will be coming to Netflix soon. He's a creator that I know. And he does a step-by-step on how comics become animation. You can look at his website at the link that I provide up here. And that link is going to kind of take you to his website where you can actually kind of see the Jet Boy animation for yourself. But especially in this particular interview, he really breaks down the process, and it's a really fascinating, very brief, but very fascinating take on how he's translating those ideas between forms. I also have this interview with Rob Trujillo, who's also a creator that I know. He did an interview with Wexner Center for the Arts in 2020. And here he's drawing portraits, but his descriptions of how he's drawing those portraits is actually really incredibly helpful for understanding the geometrizing side of comics that I was just speaking about from Aldama's work. I encourage you to look at this because seeing how he's doing these shapes and how they progress can be a really helpful way to kind of get more of a sense of how a character is drawn can really influence our interaction with them, our engagement with them, our familiarity. And though he's doing it here with portraits as opposed to comics, it's still a very helpful resource. And I've provided a screenshot for you here where you can kind of see a few examples of how kind of the, squares, circles, and triangles that Aldama was speaking to are really kind of showing through in the art that he is doing. And then finally, I want us to just kind of talk about this week's comic style zines, which by the time you watch this lecture, you will hopefully already have read. The first of which is Winging It by Peyton Del Toro, and Peyton Cristina Del Toro. She, her is a Chicana lesbian from Metro Detroit, Michigan, and a PhD student in English at The Ohio State University. She's primarily focusing on, Latinx feminism. She's very concentrated on Latina lesbians and popular culture, and also social media and tattooing. But Winging It is kind of a comic memoir that she independently published and wrote and distributed at a comic show. I know Peyton, a really amazing creator. And she, in this very brief memoir, is kind of taking us through her coming out process. And something that I want you to be really thinking about as we prepare to write the process post about this particular comic is, how is she bringing us into the conflicts of her coming out process? How is she introducing us to other characters while still maintaining the centrality of herself as kind of the narrator and protagonist, right? How is she, in a relatively short amount of space, able to cover so much ground in terms of this memoir? And is there a resolution or outcome that's presented to us? And how is she kind of, thinking about different creative forms like poetry and makeup as being spaces that perhaps offer some kind of refuge and just kind of potential, just like self energy, and thinking back to Zines, right? Some self energy that perhaps doesn't exist elsewhere in the line of this plot. We also have Couldn't Afford Therapy, So I Made This by Lawrence Lindell. And they're a cartoonist, zinester, musician, and educator from California. Lindell has been involved with DIY publishing for close to a decade, with the latest release being From Truth with Truth, Lindell's graphic memoir. And Lawrence is somebody who I also know in my real life. I wanted to note that their pronouns are he, him, they, them, or you can refer to Lawrence as Lawrence. Some folks prefer no pronouns and will ask that you just use their name in place of a pronoun every time. But there are 3 options for referring to Lawrence. Lawrence's text that I'm including for us here this week is one that has a lot going on, and that's really important in thinking about, how is he relying on kind of a color scheme that's very consistent, but he's also really collaging together and mixing together a lot of different styles for the pages that we have in this work. I want you to be really attentive to his main character. Once again, this is a memoir style comic, meaning that we are really following along with something personal to Lawrence rather than kind of, following along with the character. And he's really taking us into this intimate look into kind of how his mental health and just kind of the healthcare system at large are kind of in conflict. But more specifically, he's thinking kind of in a very grounded way about, the interpersonal and microaggressions that can occur, given that there is such a lack of support for mental health, especially for Black folks' mental health in the US. So this is one generally that I found that students really enjoy writing about, because there are quite a few layers included in their work, that in thinking about those geometrizing and storifying elements, this is sort of an excellent reference point to thinking through those things. We also have Marie and Worry Wart, comics about anxiety by Jen Woodall. And Jen Woodall, she, her, is an award-winning illustrator and comics creator who dwells in Toronto, Ontario. She's a Bachelor of Design from OCADU in illustration, as well as a BDs in fashion design. She self-publishes her own comics and also has her work distributed and published throughout Silver Sprocket, based in San Francisco. Marie and Worry Wart is one that's, I suppose, comparable to Couldn't Afford Therapy, So I Made This, in the sense that we have a creator who's also talking about mental health struggles. I want you to really be attentive to the relationship between Marie and Worry Wart in this particular text. I want you to also bring the knowledge that you've started to develop about facial expressions and body language and color to this text, because those 3 details are incredibly important to what Jen Woodall is doing in the form to communicate the content. I want you to also kind of really be thinking about, as you're reading through and rereading through this particular comic, how is she emphasizing moments of tension, moments of conflict, moments of concern, right? And how does she perhaps visualize that feeling, if you struggle with anxiety as I do, that feeling of just kind of the mounting dread or the overwhelming feeling of just having so many emotions and not being sure how to carry them all or what to do with them, right? How is she trying to capture those moments and capture those emotions in the space of the comic here? And finally, you have Your Black Friend by Ben Passmore, he, him, who lives on the island of New Orleans. His comics are about crime, monsters, anarchism, sexual dysfunction, police brutality, art theory, and his feels. Ben Passmore has a really distinct art style. Like, you see it and you know it's him. Not every comic creator is that way. Ben Passmore is that way. Like, you see his work, you just know that is his creation. Your Black Friend is a pretty short comic. However, much like Lawrence Lindell, Ben Passmore is just packing those pages with geometrizing and storyfying elements. And so I do want you to really think about with this one, especially as you look back at it compared to, your first time reading through it. If the Peyton del Toro text is, relatively open, what is the reading process like for you compared to winging it with your Black friend or couldn't afford therapy, so I made this, each of them being so jam-packed. And Jen Woodall is kind of our middle ground. But, with the Ben Passmore, I want you to be attentive to how is he introducing us to his protagonist, but especially title. Title really matters with each of these comics, but the title, Your Black Friend, I want you to think about how Ben Passmore is using the word your, how that's being articulated to perhaps make a certain point about who the kind of main focus or protagonist is in the story. I want you to really think about the kind of minute little details in this. He is very much giving us so many different little pockets of things to look at. I want you to consider also how this cover perhaps might be meaningful in different ways after having read the comic compared to when you first interact with it, right? If we think back to covers as the first point of contact, it'll be interesting to kind of think about which of the comics did you ultimately choose to read first? Did you find that you were kind of dreading reading one or excited to read another, right? Like, how are you arriving at these texts in part based on these comic covers, okay? So that is everything that I have for you today. I appreciate, as always, your patience with me with all of the tech issues and things that happen, but also the fact that I just randomly have a cough basically every time that I lecture. And hopefully you've not been hearing the thunder and lightning too much in the background because there's been a lot happening. But this is me, K-Swizzle, signing off for your in-depth lecture for the week, hoping that you are well, hoping that this lecture was helpful for you in navigating comics and zines. And I really, truly hope that you enjoyed the readings for this week and just found some meaning in them. And even if they don't directly apply to your life, I hope that they kind of helped you understand some things. And if they do apply to your life, I hope that they offered moments of just kind of refuge and safety and healing as much as possible. But I've very much enjoyed having this class so far with you this semester. I wish I could see your faces in human form, but alas, that's not possible this semester. But I am enjoying getting to know you through your writing and through your work this semester through the screen. All right, everyone, have a good rest of your day. Take care, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye.